As chief military observer of the Krell Defense Force, I've seen my share of primitive species attempting to reach for the stars. Our race has dominated this sector for 10,000 cycles, our biomechanical ships representing the pinnacle of evolution and engineering. When we detected unusual energy signatures from a previously overlooked system, I personally volunteered to lead the first contact delegation. After all, who better to evaluate these newcomers than someone of my considerable expertise? I remember standing in the Great Hall of Observation, my ceremonial cape flowing behind me as I studied the preliminary data streams. My assistant, third observer Livis, tried to suggest sending a junior team first. I nearly stripped him of rank for such foolishness. Did he not understand that I had overseen the integration of 12 species into our protectorate? That my treatise on the inevitable dominance of biotechnology in spacecraft design was required reading at the Krell Military Academy? "Prepare my flagship," I ordered, watching Livis's secondary eyes widen in surprise. "The Living Storm will lead this mission." The Living Storm was the pride of our fleet, a third-generation bioengineered dreadnought. Like all Krell ships, it had been grown rather than built, its neural pathways and organic armor developing under the careful guidance of our most skilled geneticists. Its central nervous system was sophisticated enough to anticipate my commands before I gave them, and its regenerative capabilities made it practically invulnerable to the crude weapons most emerging species possessed. The preliminary scans showed they had barely achieved FTL capability. Their system contained only 8 planets, and they'd only managed to colonize one other besides their homeworld, primitive as expected. I assembled a fleet of our finest vessels, sleek, organic ships that could outmaneuver anything in known space, and prepared to demonstrate proper protocol to yet another species that would inevitably join our protectorate. As we prepared for departure, I reviewed the standard first contact procedures. We would emerge from FTL in a lotus formation, our ships arrayed in the traditional pattern that had struck awe into countless primitive species. The Living Storm would take the center position, its iridescent hull gleaming in the starlight, while our escort vessels would pulse with bioluminescent patterns demonstrating our technological superiority. I had already begun drafting my acceptance speech for when they inevitably requested protectorate status. Perhaps I would even allow them to maintain some degree of autonomy if they showed proper deference. After all, magnanimity was a trait expected of superior beings such as ourselves. "The fleet is ready," Chief Observer Livis reported, his posture appropriately submissive. "Excellent," I replied, settling into my neural interface chair. As the organic tendrils connected with my nervous system, I felt the Living Storm's consciousness merge with my own. Set course for the human system. It's time to welcome another species into the embrace of civilization. How foolish I was. How utterly, embarrassingly foolish. We dropped out of FTL at the edge of their system, expecting to see the usual scattered settlements and crude spacecraft. Instead, our sensors detected thousands of artificial satellites orbiting their homeworld. Curious, but hardly impressive. Their orbital defense platforms were particularly amusing, bulky things of metal and composite materials, lacking the elegant bioengineering of our own platforms. Chief Observer Livis called from his monitoring pod, his antenna twitching with confusion. "I'm detecting unusual energy signatures from their orbital installations." I waved a dismissive limb. "No doubt some primitive attempt at shields or weapon systems. Record everything for the Academy. It will make an excellent case study in inefficient engineering." The Living Storm's neural network pulsed with new information as our long-range scanners mapped their system. They had mining operations on their moons and neighboring planets, a scatter of habitation domes on their red neighbor world, and a complex network of communication buoys stretching to the system's edge. Somewhat more advanced than our initial estimates, but nothing extraordinary. Then we detected their ships. I actually laughed when the first images came through. They were using chemical propulsion for their smaller vessels. The larger ones appeared to use some form of primitive fusion drive. They were all angular, geometric shapes, boxes and cylinders with none of the flowing organic grace of proper Krell design. "Magnify that vessel," I ordered, pointing to one of their larger ships. The holographic display zoomed in on what appeared to be their equivalent of a heavy cruiser. Its hull was a patchwork of armor plates and exposed framework, with massive radiator fins extending like primitive wings. Dozens of what appeared to be weapon emplacements dotted its surface. How inefficient. Our bioships could reconfigure their weapon pods as needed, yet these humans seemed to think the solution was simply to attach more guns. Their ships appear to be heavily armored, Chief Observer, our tactical analyst, noted. The metal alloys they're using are unusual, extremely dense. Compensating for poor design with brute force. Obviously, I replied. A common trait among younger species. They'll learn better under our guidance. I ordered our fleet to advance, preparing the standard greeting that had brought hundreds of species under our benevolent guidance. The living storm led the formation, our escort ships arranging themselves in the time-honored pattern that represented the geometric perfection of Krell philosophy. As we approached their defense perimeter, I had our ships activate their bioluminescent displays, 1,000 patterns of light rippling across our organic hulls in mathematically perfect sequences. Let them see what true advancement looks like, I said smugly to my bridge crew. Livis, begin broadcasting the standard greeting sequence. That's when everything changed. That's when everything I thought I knew about spacecraft design was turned upside down. One of their larger vessels, an ugly, rectangular thing they called a carrier, launched smaller craft. We'd seen this before, of course. The Krell pioneered carrier tactics millennia ago. But these ships, they were accelerating at rates that should have turned their crews to paste. Impossible, I exclaimed, all four of my hearts racing as I watched the tactical display. Check those readings again. Confirmed, Chief Observer. Our science officer's mandibles were clicking in agitation as she reported their maneuverability. The human fighters are pulling sustained turns at over 30 gravities. Their pilots should be dead. I leaned forward in my neural interface chair, feeling the living storm's confusion matching my own. The small human craft were darting between our escort vessels with impossible agility, performing maneuvers that defied everything I knew about inertial forces and structural integrity. One of them pulled a turn so sharp it would have torn our bioships apart at the molecular level. How are they surviving these forces? Livis wondered aloud, his usual protocol forgotten in his amazement. Our sensor officer, Senior Analyst Krente, pulled up detailed scans of the human vessels. They appear to be using some form of liquid suspension system for their pilots. The entire command module is floating inside the ship's frame, and their structural reinforcement is unlike anything in our database. It's as if they designed their ships assuming they would need to withstand forces that would kill any sensible species. I watched as more carriers began launching their fighters. Each human capital ship seemed to carry dozens of these small craft, all of them moving with the same impossible agility. Our own escort fighters, the pride of Krell and bioengineering, would be hopelessly outmaneuvered if it came to combat. Chief Observer, our tactical officer, called out, her scales pale with concern. I'm detecting unusual readings from their larger vessels as well. Their weapon systems, they're not energy-based. I ordered a detailed scan of one of their destroyers. The results shook me to my core. Instead of the elegant plasma lances or particle beams used by every civilized species, these humans had built massive railguns into their ships. The kinetic energy calculations made my inner eyelids flutter in disbelief. A single hit from one of these crude weapons would punch straight through our most sophisticated organic armor. By the first egg, I whispered, watching as their fleet continued to deploy with ruthless efficiency. They're not trying to be elegant. They're not trying to be efficient. They just built the most brutally effective weapons they could imagine and found ways to survive using them. Sir Livis's voice was quiet. They're maintaining perfect firing solutions on every ship in our fleet, have been since we arrived. Their targeting systems are impressive. I sank back in my chair, feeling the living storm's nervous energy through our neural link. We had spent thousands of cycles perfecting our bioships, making them more elegant, more efficient, more sophisticated. And here were these humans, barely out of their gravity well, who had looked at the problems of space combat and solved them with brute force and determination. It was time to swallow my pride. The humans, as they called themselves, were polite enough when we established communications. They seemed genuinely excited to meet us, though I noticed their ships had maintained perfect firing solutions on our fleet the entire time. Their captain, a disarmingly friendly female called Lily MacDonald, gave us a tour of one of their destroyers. I suspect she knew exactly what she was doing by offering this, showing us just enough to ensure we understood our relative positions. Our engineers would love to exchange ideas, she said, leading us through corridors that thrummed with barely contained power. We've never seen bioorganic ships before. The applications could be revolutionary. I managed not to flinch at her casual mention of adapting our sacred biotechnology. Livis, accompanying me on the tour, was less successful at hiding his shock. The human pretended not to notice. I'll never forget walking through those corridors. Where we had grown our ships with living tissue and neural networks, they had built theirs from steel and titanium. Where we had elegant bioreactors, they had massive fusion engines barely contained by magnetic fields. Their weapons weren't the precise plasma lances we used, but crude kinetic accelerators that could punch clean through our supposedly superior hulls. "This is our main engineering section," Captain MacDonald announced, leading us into a cavernous chamber dominated by their fusion core. The containment chamber alone was larger than the Living Storm's entire power generation system. "We're running a bit hot today, had to push the reactors to get here quickly when we detected your arrival." "Running hot?" Livis inquired. "Oh, just about 15% over recommended containment specs," she replied casually. "Nothing to worry about. The safety margins are generous." I felt my scales ripple in horror. They intentionally built their ships to operate beyond safe limits? The concept was so alien, so fundamentally opposed to everything we believed about proper engineering, that I nearly missed her next statement. "Of course, that's just the main reactor. The emergency backup can push to 40% over specs if we need it. Never had to try that outside of testing, thankfully." The tour continued through their weapon control centers, where grim-faced humans monitored targeting systems that had never lost their lock on our fleet. Through their fighter bays, where maintenance crews worked on craft designed to endure forces that would reduce our own pilots to paste. Through their medical facilities, equipped to handle the ridiculous array of injuries their crews might sustain from operating their ships at such extreme parameters. I submitted my report to the High Tribunal that evening, recommending immediate diplomatic recognition of humanity as equals. Some of my colleagues called me mad. But I had seen the truth. While we had spent millennia perfecting what we thought was the only right way to build ships, humanity had simply asked, "Will it work?" and then made it work, through sheer determination. "They're barbarians," tribunal member Trix declared when I presented my findings. "Their ships are crude. Their methods are inelegant. Their entire approach to spacecraft design is an affront to proper engineering principles." "Yes," I replied calmly. "And in a war, they would annihilate us." The tribunal ignored my warning. That's why I'm no longer chief military observer, and why the humans now have an embassy on our homeworld instead of a protectorate governor. Sometimes it seems crude efficiency trumps elegant perfection. The humans even hired me as a consultant after my dismissal, seeking ways to combine their brutal pragmatism with our biotechnology. I've learned to appreciate their perspective. Just yesterday, I watched one of their engineers testing a new hybrid drive system. When I suggested the power levels were dangerously high, she just grinned and said, "Oh, we know. That's why we're testing it behind 6 feet of armor plate." Perhaps there's something to be said for their approach after all. End report. Former Chief Military Observer Keksi. Filed Human Embassy Archives. Note: this document is required reading for all Krell and Military Academy students. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I hope you loved it. Please remember to subscribe if you did like it so you can see more videos like this. And please give us a like and a comment too. I'll see you in the next one.